All right, let's dive in. We've got some excerpts you sent from an academic article, and the title itself is like a magnet, The Dissolution of Canadian Identity.
Definitely grabs your attention.
Yeah, so where does this even go?
It really makes you stop and think about what it means to be Canadian today, especially, I think, in light of multiculturalism.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The article just jumps right into a critique of the way we talk about identity, those oppressor versus oppressed narratives. It even says this kind of language can be dehumanizing.
Yeah, and that's a huge point, actually. This source, it connects this critique to the whole debate around post-colonialism, identity politics, It suggests that even demanding specific forms of recognition, even though it's understandable, it can sometimes it can backfire.
So it's less about the labels themselves, but more about how we use them. And the article throws in this whole other thing, the Treaty of Westphalia, because I had to do some Googling, brush up on my history. What's the deal with this treaty?
Well, it's a pretty major moment, right? It basically created the structure for modern nation states because it links the idea of a state to a nation. And the source's definition of a nation is pretty interesting. Shared descent, culture, history, language, all the things that create that sense of collective identity.
So you're saying that the very idea of Canada being a nation state, it all goes back to this old treaty.
Yes.
And this treaty connects our identity to this idea of shared heritage.
Right.
And now multiculturalism is kind of challenging that. Okay, things are getting complicated.
That's the argument. And it even goes on to suggest that demanding recognition based on those characteristics, the shared ones, can actually be like a form of nationalism.
Which is, could be seen as problematic, right?
Yeah.
So now I'm rethinking what I thought I knew about national pride. Okay, but then we get to multiculturalism. The source calls it the Canadian experiment. It even quotes Trudeau using that exact phrase.
It's kind of wild, right? Thinking about it as this experiment on a whole nation.
Yeah, it kind of blows my mind.
What's interesting is how the source says multiculturalism was a strategy to manage the tension, the historical tension, between French and English Canada.
So it wasn't just like, oh, let's embrace diversity just because.
Right.
More like, how do we keep things balanced?
It's saying that's how they prevented the absorption of French-Canadian identity.
That's a whole perspective I hadn't even thought about.
And if multiculturalism, by definition, means there's no single Canadian identity based on shared heritage, then
what does it even mean?
Yeah, what does it even mean to be Canadian? That's the central question here.
That's a big one. Okay, and to make things even more complex, the source says, hold on, Canada hasn't always been this diverse, multicultural, mosaic that we talk about. They argue it was mostly European until pretty recently.
Yeah, and that's where this idea of biculturalism comes in. For a long time, the source is saying Canadian identity came mainly from the interplay between French and British influences.
Okay, and they describe this distinct early French-Canadian identity shaped by the land, the Catholic faith, and this loyalty to the crown.
Which goes back to their point about shared struggles, proximity. Those are really powerful forces in creating a national identity. Sometimes, even more than a shared origin, they actually use the pre-1965 Canadian flag as an example.
The one with the Union Jack.
Yeah, the Union Jack and the fleur-de-lis. Those represent that bicultural heritage. Do you remember that flag?
Yeah, I do. It's definitely a more bicultural symbol, right? But the source actually sees the current flag as how we've moved away from that framework, which leads to their main question. What is Canadian identity today within the framework of multiculturalism? They even argue that the traditional things, Canadian nationalism or even Canadian values, have become problematic terms.
Right. So if those old markers are gone, what takes their place? The source says it's values like tolerance, equality, and human rights.
Which on the surface sound pretty good. But then they use this phrase, flaky principles. I'm curious about that. What makes them flaky?
Well, they suggest that these values, as good as they are, can be susceptible to trends, to social trends, It's constantly shifting. And they contrast this with a historical Canadian identity that was more rooted in loyalty, submission to authority, and a shared purpose, often connected to faith.
And that connection between faith and identity is one of the most thought-provoking parts of this whole thing. They're saying that less religious faith directly links to a weaker Canadian identity.
Yeah, they see it as a crisis of purpose. Those old sources of authority and meaning, they've been replaced by secular institutions. It's like people are searching for something to fill that gap.
And they tie it back to multiculturalism, saying that even though it's supposed to be inclusive, it might actually be adding to this sense of, like, anarchy, this disconnect from any core values or shared history.
It's a lot to take in. It really makes you think about the implications of multiculturalism. But it leaves us with this question: what happens next?
So much to think about. Colonialism, biculturalism, now multiculturalism. My brain is doing backflips trying to process it all.
It really does get you thinking, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's important to remember the source isn't just trying to tear down all these ideas. They're just trying to get us to think about multiculturalism, about all its complexities, and to really think about all the unintended consequences, like to really consider what it means to be Canadian.
You think there's hope? Are we just doomed to this, like, fragmented, dissolved identity?
I think there's always hope, but it requires honesty. We have to acknowledge all the tensions that exist in society, and we have to move past those simple narratives, oppressor versus oppressed, all that, because as the source pointed out, that kind of language doesn't really help anyone.
I see that. But how do we even find common ground when there's so many different cultures and beliefs and values? Because it sounds like the source is saying that multiculturalism is part of the problem.
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. The source doesn't really offer any easy answers, but it keeps pointing to the need for shared purpose, some kind of core principles that can unite us despite all our differences.
Okay, so what could that even be?
Well, interestingly, they point back to a time when Canadian identity was rooted in a belief in authority, submitting to a higher power.
You mean like religion? Isn't that kind of outdated in today's world?
Well, that's what a lot of people think, but the source challenges that. They argue that the decline of religious faith has created a void, a crisis of purpose that we try to fill with consumerism, individualism, fleeting social trends.
Okay, so you're saying we need something to believe in that's bigger than ourselves, something that brings us together. But what could that be?
That's the question, right? And I don't think it has to be about finding religion. It's more about rediscovering core values, the values that have always been part of Canada. Things like loyalty, duty, compassion, a commitment to the common good, all of that.
But didn't the source say those values were tied to a belief in a natural hierarchy, like a social order that we don't really have today?
Yeah, that's true. But they also suggested that a sense of hierarchy and order can still exist, even in a more egalitarian society. Think about our institutions, our laws, democracy, all that. All of those depend on a certain level of trust, a respect for authority, and a willingness to work together.
I'm following you, but the source also said our current institutions are imperfect, based on blind consensus, and they change with public opinion.
Yeah, and they have a point there. Our institutions are always evolving, and they're definitely influenced by what's happening in society, by politics, by trends. But that doesn't mean we should just give up on them. It just means we need to engage critically, hold them accountable, and work towards making them more just and fair.
So active citizens, not just going with the flow.
Exactly. And remember that phrase, Canada is a nation of loyalists. But that loyalty, it needs to be informed. Active. It should be rooted in a deep understanding of our shared history, our values, and our responsibility to build a better society.
That's inspiring, but also kind of daunting. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The source points to reclaiming our narratives.
Reclaiming our narratives. What does that even mean?
It means moving beyond the language of identity politics. We need to tell our own stories. Celebrate how complex our experiences are, both individually and collectively, and find the things that connect us rather than divide us.
Okay, I like that, focusing on the things that connect us. But the source also talked about recognizing our shared European heritage. Doesn't that exclude people who come from other backgrounds?
I think it's a valid concern, but remember, the source wasn't advocating for European heritage as the only basis of Canadian identity. They were just arguing for a more balanced view of our history. We should recognize the contributions of all Canadians, but we also need to understand the historical forces at play.
So it's more about seeing the whole picture, the whole tapestry, not just focusing on one little thread.
Exactly. And within that tapestry, we can find those threads of commonality, the values, the struggles, the triumphs that unite us as Canadians, no matter what our backgrounds are.
This is making a lot of sense. But I'm still kind of stuck on the role of government. The source said multiculturalism was imposed on us, not something Canadians actually wanted.
Yeah, and that raises a really important question about the state's role in shaping national identity. Can the government really tell us what it means to be Canadian?
They can promote certain things, like the flag, the anthem, holidays, but can they really create a national identity?
They can try, but a true national identity has to come from the people. from shared experiences, values, hopes, all that. The source actually argues that in Canada, the government's embrace of multiculturalism might have actually stopped a cohesive national identity from forming.
How so?
By focusing on our differences instead of our commonalities, they might have accidentally created fragmentation. Think about all the arguments we have today about what it even means to be Canadian, debates about values, our history, our place in the world.
It does feel like we're always questioning who we are.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Debate is important in a democracy, but these debates need to be grounded in a shared understanding of who we are and what we stand for.
Okay, so how do we even get there? How do we build that understanding when there are so many different opinions?
It starts with having honest conversations, creating spaces where people can share their experiences, their perspectives, and their hopes for Canada.
Like town halls, community events.
Those are great examples. But it can also happen in smaller settings, with our families, our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors.
Yeah.
It's about listening to each other, understanding each other's points of view, and finding that common ground that brings us together as Canadians.
Building bridges, not walls. I like that. But what about those who don't want to have these conversations? People who are stuck in the us versus them mindset. How do we reach them?
Well, I think most people, even those who seem set in their ways, want the same basic things: a sense of belonging, a safe community, a future they can feel hopeful about. If we can connect with those desires, maybe that can bridge the gaps between different viewpoints.
So it's about reminding ourselves that we're all on the same team, even when we disagree.
Exactly, and focusing on what unites us, not what divides us. Because when we do that, we start to see that our differences can actually be a good thing. They can make us stronger, more creative, more innovative.
I love that idea, turning those differences into strengths.
Yeah.
But it can't just be about, like, good vibes. It has to lead to action, right? So what can we actually do to create a more unified Canada?
Well, for starters, we can support the people who are already doing the work, the organizations and groups that are building those bridges, fostering dialogue, and celebrating Canada's diversity.
Yeah, volunteering, donating, just spreading the word. That all makes a difference.
Absolutely. And on a more personal level, we can all make an effort to learn about different cultures, step outside our comfort zones, challenge our own biases.
Be curious, be open, see the world through other people's eyes. That's how we realize how much we actually have in common.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that every little thing we do, even if it seems small, can contribute to a bigger movement towards a more just, equal, and unified Canada.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We've explored the challenges, the good, the bad, and everything in between when it comes to Canadian identity in today's world. And what I'm taking away from all of this is hope, and that we all need to take action.
Yeah, the future of Canada isn't set in stone. It's something we create together. It's about the choices we make, what we do, and how committed we are to building a nation that reflects our values and what we want for our future.
So to everyone listening, what will you do to contribute to a stronger, more unified Canada? What kind of conversations would you start having? What bridges will you build?
The answer is inside all of us. This deep dive might be ending, but our journey keeps going, so go out there and explore.
Wow, so much to think about. We've covered so much ground, from the very beginning of Canadian identity to, like, questioning what even holds us together today. It's a lot.
It really is a lot to unpack, but I think the source, it hints at some ways forward, and maybe that's a good place to start now.
Yeah, for sure. We've done a lot of analyzing, but what can we actually do to build a stronger Canada, a more unified one, you know?
Well, they keep talking about shared narratives, like reclaiming our stories and finding those connections that bridge the gaps between us. I think that's a good place to start thinking about action.
Yeah, but how do we actually do that? Especially in a society that feels so divided sometimes, it's like everyone's in their own little bubble.
It's a real concern. But imagine, what if instead of these separate bubbles, we created spaces for real dialogue, where people can actually listen to each other and try to understand each other's experiences.
They're not just, like, debating different opinions, but actually connecting with each other.
Exactly. And that can look like a lot of different things: town halls, community events, even just like conversations with our families, at work, with our neighbors. It's about creating a space where people feel safe to share and to listen.
Okay, I love that. But what about the people who just aren't interested in that? The ones who are really stuck in that us versus them mentality?
I think even those people, they want the same basic things, right? They
Yeah.
want to belong. They want to feel safe. They want a good future for themselves and their
So if
families.
we can tap into those shared desires.
I think that can help to bridge those divides. It's about reminding each other that we're all in this together, even when we don't agree on everything.
And maybe shifting the focus from what divides us to what unites us.
Right. And when we do that, we start to see that all our differences, they can actually be a source of strength. We
Yeah.
can learn from each other, grow together.
I love that. Turning differences into strengths. But it can't just be about good feelings, right? We have to do something. What are some concrete things we can do?
Well, there are organizations and groups doing great work already, building bridges between communities, promoting dialogue, celebrating diversity. We can support them.
Volunteering, donating, even just spreading the word.
Yeah, absolutely. And on a more personal level, we can all make an effort to learn about different cultures, challenge our own biases, step outside of our comfort zones.
Be more open-minded. See things from other perspectives.
Exactly. And every little action, every choice we make can make a difference. It all adds up.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like we've explored some really tough questions, but I'm actually feeling pretty hopeful about the future of Canada.
Me too. It's easy to get discouraged when we focus on all the things that divide us, but I think this conversation has shown that there's a lot of common ground too, and that gives me hope.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, we want to leave you with this question. What will you do to help build a stronger, more unified Canada? Even a small action can make a difference. So think about it. What will you do?
We've reached the end of this deep dive, but it's really just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep learning, keep connecting with each other. And together, we can build a better future for Canada.